$312.14. That was the sum total of my liquidity for the next 30 days. I stood in the entryway of my basement apartment in Cicero, the screen of my phone illuminating the peeling beige paint of the wall. Above me, the heavy footsteps of the landlord and his 3 Great Danes vibrated through the ceiling, shaking dust onto the shoulder of my wool coat. I brushed the gray flakes away with a lint roller I kept by the door for this exact purpose. It was not just about being clean, it was about maintenance. If you take care of things, they last. That was the logic I applied to my 10-year-old Boots, my career as a forensic accountant, and my relationship with my father. I took a breath of the damp subterranean air, told myself that sacrifice was just the down payment on stability, and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind to wait for the cheapest rideshare option available. The Golden Oak was the kind of restaurant where the air conditioning smelled like old money and lemon polish. I felt the change in atmospheric pressure the moment the valet looked past my arrival to open the door for a Bentley behind me. I walked in, my eyes automatically scanning the room and calculating the overhead. The mahogany paneling, the imported crystal, the waitstaff to patron ratio. It was a hemorrhaging of capital disguised as hospitality. Then I saw him. Richard Halloway sat at the center table, a gravitational pull of charisma and Italian silk. He stood as I approached, his smile tight, his eyes scanning me like an item on a balance sheet that was failing to perform. "Margaret, you are late," he said, though I was exactly 3 minutes early. He reached out his manicured hands, adjusting the lapel of my coat, his knuckles grazing my neck. It was not a caress, it was a correction. "You look tired, Meg. And this coat, it hangs on you like a sack. We are celebrating tonight. Try to look like you belong in the room. Perception is reality." I sat down, placing my purse on the floor because it was out of season. I wanted to tell him about the water heater leaking in my apartment, or the student loan interest rate that had just adjusted upward. But Richard did not traffic in problems, only solutions. He ordered a bottle of Cabernet that cost more than my monthly rent without asking me. He spoke about leverage and synergy and a development project in the Loop that was going to change the skyline. I nodded, dissecting his sentences. I listened for the data, but heard only buzzwords. It was a habit I could not break. In my line of work, adjectives were usually hiding a deficit. Then the air shifted again. Grandfather Arthur arrived. He looked older than when he had left for Zurich 5 years ago, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through the ambient dimness of the restaurant. He bypassed Richard's outstretched hand and wrapped me in a hug that smelled of pipe tobacco and rain. He sat down, waving away the waiter who tried to hand him a menu. "I missed you, little bean," Arthur said, using the nickname I had not heard since I was 12. He looked at Richard, then back to me, his smile softening the hard lines of his face. "I trust Richard has been handling the transition well. I was worried the paperwork would be a headache." Richard cleared his throat loudly. "The wine list, Dad. You must see the vintage selection." Arthur ignored him. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the white tablecloth. "Tell me, Meg, how is the apartment?" "The view of the lake must be breathtaking this time of year. I specifically chose the unit on the 35th floor so you could see the sunrise over the water." The data did not compute. I blinked, my mind racing through the filing cabinet of my memory, looking for a reference I might have missed. A joke? A metaphor? I looked at Richard. He was staring intently at his wine glass, his jaw muscle twitching in a rhythmic spasm. I looked back at my grandfather. His face was open, expectant, waiting for gratitude he believed he had earned. "Grandpa," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "I do not understand. I live in a basement unit in Cicero. I do not have a view of the lake. I have a view of a brick wall." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. The clatter of silverware from the next table sounded like a gunshot. Richard dropped his heavy silver fork. It hit the porcelain rim of his plate with a violence that made the couple at the next table turn their heads. A bead of sweat broke free from Richard's hairline, rolling down his temple. He let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves being crushed. "Dad, you are confused. The jet lag. We talked about this. The Lakeshore Drive property is an investment vehicle. I am managing it for her, building her portfolio. She is not ready for that kind of overhead." Arthur did not look at his son. He kept his eyes on me. I saw the confusion in them curdle into something colder, into realization. "Meg," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "Have you ever set foot in a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive?" "No," I said. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. Meg, come with me. You are upsetting your grandfather with this nonsense. We need to clear this up. Now." He gripped my upper arm. His fingers dug into the muscles, steering me away from the table past the confused hostess and toward the alcove near the restrooms. He pushed me into the corner, his body blocking the light, his charm evaporated. The mask was gone. Beneath it was just desperate, seething panic. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive wine on his breath. "You are going to go back out there and tell him you were confused. You are going to tell him you sublet the place because you wanted to save money. Do you hear me why I asked?" The question was a reflex. "Because I am your father and I know what is best for you," he snapped. "I am building an empire. Meg, liquidating assets for cash flow is standard business practice. You would not understand. You are too busy counting pennies to see the big picture. I did this for us, for the family image." He was using the same tone he used when I was 10 and asked why we couldn't afford a vacation. Gaslighting, distortion, but I was not 10 anymore. I was a senior forensic accountant. I spent my days tracking the digital footprints of embezzlers and fraudsters. I looked at the man in front of me. I looked at the sweat on his lip, the dilation of his pupils, the defensive posture. I did not see a father. I saw a subject. I saw a discrepancy in the ledger. He told me I was wasting money. He told me I needed to learn the value of $1. For 10 years, I had eaten instant noodles and walked to work while he was allegedly managing an asset worth millions. "You spent it," I said. It was not a question. Richard's face turned a mottled red. "Do not speak to me like that. I am the only reason you have a career. I am the only reason you are not on the street. Now fix your face. Go back to the table. Lie to him, or so help me God. Margaret, I will make sure you never work in this town again." He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and composed his features back into the mask of the successful tycoon. He turned and walked back toward the dining room, assuming I would follow, assuming I would fall in line. I stood there for a moment in the dim hallway. I felt the cold draft from the entrance. I thought about the $312 in my bank account. I thought about the mold on my coat. Then I thought about the dates. 10 years. 120 months. If there was a penthouse, there were property taxes. There were maintenance fees. There were withdrawals. I did not cry. Crying was an emotional release, and this situation did not require emotion. It required an audit. I reached into my purse not to check my makeup, but to check the battery life on my phone. I was not going back to the table to eat. I had work to do. I did not go back to the basement in Cicero. The damp walls and the sound of the landlord's television would have clouded my judgment, and tonight I needed the sterility of a laboratory. I drove my rusted sedan to the 24-hour university library in the Loop, where I still held alumni privileges. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that calmed my nervous system. I found a corner cubicle, opened my laptop, and did exactly what I did every day from 9 to 5. I opened a new case file. Subject: Richard Halloway. My first move was legal, not emotional. I waited until 8 in the morning, the second business hours began, and dialed the number for Elias Henderson, my grandfather's attorney. My hands were steady, but my heart rate was elevated, thumping a traitorous rhythm against my ribs. When Elias answered, his voice was warm, a stark contrast to the cold precision I needed to employ. I cut through his pleasantries. I told him I needed a full accounting of the Halloway family trust. He hesitated, citing protocol, mentioning that my father was the trustee. I cited the Illinois Trust Code, specifically the section regarding the rights of a qualified beneficiary to receive reports. I reminded him that negligence in disclosure could lead to disbarment. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Then he agreed to upload the documents to a secure server. While the files were being transferred, I met Arthur at a diner near his hotel. He looked small in the booth, his hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup. I did not want to hurt him, but I needed to calibrate my data. I asked him a single direct question. How much money had he sent? Arthur looked out the window at the gray Chicago street. He told me he had set up a standing wire transfer of $20,000 a month for 10 years to cover the mortgage, the HOA fees, and my living expenses, so I could focus on my studies and my career. $20,000 a month. I calculated the sum in my head instantly. $2.4 million over a decade. I looked down at my shoes, the soles worn thin, and nodded. I did not tell him I had eaten instant oatmeal for dinner 3 nights in a row. I simply thanked him, paid the bill with my credit card that was near its limit, and went back to work. The digital paper trail was a mess, but chaos is just a pattern you have not decoded yet. I spent the afternoon cross-referencing the bank statements Elias sent me against public property records from the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. Richard was sloppy. Narcissists often are. They believe they are too smart to be caught, so they leave fingerprints. The penthouse on Lakeshore Drive was not rented out. It was held in a shell company, RH Ventures, of which Richard was the sole signatory. But ownership was only half the equation. I needed to know the burn rate. I needed to know where the cash flow was going if it was not going to the mortgage. I drove to Lakeshore Drive. The building was a tower of glass and steel that reflected the gray sky. I parked my car 2 blocks away to avoid suspicion and put on a generic windbreaker and a baseball cap. I picked up an empty cardboard box from my trunk, sealed it with tape, and walked to the service entrance. Security was tight, but human error is a constant variable. I waited until a food delivery driver buzzed in and caught the door before it latched. I took the elevator to the 35th floor. The hallway smelled of fresh lilies and money. I stood in front of Unit 35B, my apartment. The one my grandfather bought for me. I rang the doorbell. I expected silence. I expected a tenant. I did not expect the door to open, revealing a woman younger than me. She was wearing a silk robe that shimmered under the recessed lighting. Her hair was professionally blown out, and on her finger sat a canary yellow diamond that looked suspiciously like the one from my mother's old jewelry set, a set Richard claimed had been lost in a robbery 5 years ago. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at my cheap windbreaker with disdain. "Package for Mr. Holloway." I lied, holding out the empty box. She sighed, a sound of immense boredom. "Just put it on the table. Richard is not here. He is at the club." I stepped inside. The space was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the lake just as Arthur had described. But the furniture was modern, stark, and masculine. On the counter lay a set of car keys for a Porsche and a brochure for a luxury spa in the Maldives. This woman was not a tenant. She was a dependent, a beneficiary of funds that carried my name. I set the box down and walked out. I had visual confirmation. The data set was complete. I returned to the library as the sun began to set. I did not feel rage. Rage is hot and messy. What I felt was the cold, hard clarity of absolute zero. I opened Excel. This was my sword and my shield. I created 3 columns. Column A I labeled principal injection. I inputted the data from the bank statements, $20,000 recurring monthly. The sum at the bottom was a clean, round, staggering number. Column B I labeled beneficiary distribution. This was my column. I entered the data. 0, 0, 0. For 120 rows, the value was null. Column C I labeled misappropriation of funds. Here I began to enter the line items from the credit card statements attached to the trust account. Porsche lease payments. First-class flights to Milan. Jewelry stores. A monthly allowance to an account named Crystal Waters. The numbers cascaded down the screen, a waterfall of greed. I stared at the spreadsheet. The conditional formatting turned the negative values red. My screen was bleeding. For a decade, I had believed that my poverty was a moral failing. I thought I was struggling because I was not working hard enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough. I had internalized every lecture Richard gave me about fiscal responsibility while he was drinking wine bought with my inheritance. I looked at the sum in the bottom right corner. He had not just stolen my money, he had stolen my 20s. He had stolen my sense of security. He had stolen the truth. I saved the file as auditfinal.xlsx. I closed the laptop. The crying was done. The grieving was done. The books were unbalanced, and it was my job to correct them. I was no longer a daughter. I was the auditor, and the audit was about to begin. The manila folder weighed less than a pound, but it held the mass of 10 stolen years as I carried it into the Holloway Enterprises suite on the 42nd floor. The receptionist, a woman who had never bothered to learn my name in 5 years, tried to wave me off, claiming he was in a strategy session, but I walked past her desk without breaking stride. I pushed open the double glass doors. Richard was alone practicing his putting stroke on a strip of artificial turf he had installed near the window. He looked up, annoyed, his putter hovering mid-swing. "Margaret," he said, his tone clipping the end of my name. I told you never to interrupt me during market hours. I did not apologize. I walked to his desk, a sprawling expanse of imported mahogany that cost more than my entire student loan balance, and dropped the folder in the center. It landed with a heavy, flat thud that silenced the room. I want the deed to the penthouse, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was steady, anchored by the rows of data I had memorized. I want the remaining balance of the trust transferred to an account under my sole control, today. Richard leaned his putter against the wall and sighed the sound of a parent indulging a toddler. He walked to the desk, flipped the folder open, and glanced at the spreadsheet. He did not read it. He did not need to. He knew the numbers better than I did because he had spent them. He closed the folder and looked at me, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a predator, realizing the prey has nowhere to run. You have been busy, he said. Forensic accounting. I always said you had a mind for the minutiae. It is a shame you lack the vision for the big picture. The big picture is that you embezzled $2.4 million from your own daughter, I said. Embezzled is such a legalistic word, Meg. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between us. I utilized idle capital. I invested in the Holloway brand. That money bought the suits that close deals. It bought the dinners that secure investors. It bought the illusion that keeps this family relevant. You think you are independent? You are a mouse living in a basement because you are too afraid to step into the light. I did you a favor. I managed the burden of wealth so you could play at being a martyr. Give me the money, Richard, or I go to the authorities. He stopped laughing. His face went slack, the charm draining away to reveal something reptilian and cold. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. You will do no such thing. You are a nobody, Margaret. You are a gray little auditor with a cheap haircut and a sad life. Without me, without the name I built, you are nothing. If you try to expose me, I will bury you. I will ruin your reputation so thoroughly that you will not be able to get a job counting change at a gas station. I stared at him, documenting this new variable. This was not a father protecting a child. This was a CEO liquidating a threat. I turned around and walked out. I did not slam the door. I closed it gently, ensuring the latch clicked. The retaliation was swift and calculated, arriving with the efficiency of a high-frequency trading algorithm. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I was summoned to the office of the managing partner at my firm. Sarah, a woman who had mentored me for 3 years, would not meet my eyes. She stared at a printout on her desk. We received a credible tip regarding financial irregularities in your personal filings, Sarah said, her voice stiff. There are allegations of commingling family funds and potential money laundering. Given the nature of our work, we have a zero-tolerance policy for even the appearance of impropriety. But that is a lie, I started to say, my stomach dropping. It is under investigation, she cut me off. Until this is resolved, we have to place you on immediate unpaid suspension. We will need your badge and your laptop. I handed them over. I walked out of the building with a cardboard box containing a stapler and a potted succulent, passing colleagues who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. My career, built on unassailable ethics and 80-hour work weeks, had been paused by a single phone call from a man who knew exactly which levers to pull. I drove home to Cicero, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I needed to regroup. I needed a safe harbor. But when I pulled up to the curb, I saw my belongings. My clothes, my books, my meager furniture were piled on the sidewalk like refuse. The landlord, Mr. Kowalski, stood on the porch, his arms crossed. He looked guilty, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I am sorry, Meg, he said as I approached. A holding company bought the note on the building this morning. They called in the debt. They said they want the unit vacant for immediate renovation. They gave me cash to have you out by noon, Richard. He had not just fired me, he was erasing me. I loaded what I could into the back seat of my 10-year-old sedan. The rest, the old desk, the mattress, the lamps I had to leave behind for the scavengers. That night, the temperature in Chicago dropped to single digits. I parked my car in the back corner of a 24-hour superstore lot nestled between a snowplow and a dumpster to block the wind. I turned the engine off to save gas, wrapping myself in 3 layers of blankets. The windows fogged up quickly, sealing me in a capsule of freezing gray. I sat there watching my breath plume in the air. I had played by the rules. I had saved. I had studied. I had been the good daughter. And here I was, homeless and unemployed, while my father slept in a penthouse paid for with my inheritance. A sob rose in my throat, a hot, jagged thing. I let it out. I cried for the little girl who waited by the window for a dad who never came home early. I cried for the woman who ate toast for dinner to pay off loans she did not need to have. I cried until my chest ached and the cold began to seep into my bones. Then the tears stopped. I wiped my face with the rough wool of my glove. I looked at the condensation dripping down the windshield. The sadness began to crystallize into something harder, something sharp. Richard Halloway did not see me as a human being. In his ledger, I was a bad asset, a non-performing loan, something to be written off and discarded to improve the bottom line. He had made a critical error in his valuation. He assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. He assumed that because I followed the rules, I did not know how to weaponize them. I sat up straight in the driver's seat. I checked the time on my phone. The battery was low, but my resolve was fully charged. I did not want his love anymore. That account was closed. I did not want his approval. That currency was worthless. I wanted an audit, a full forensic scorched earth audit. I was going to balance the books, and I was going to make sure the final number on his line was 0. I waited until the sun rose over the frozen skyline of Chicago, turning the gray ice on my windshield into blinding gold. I did not turn on the heat. I needed the cold to keep me sharp. Richard had taken my job and my home, thinking those were the sources of my power. He was wrong. My power was not in what I owned, but in what I knew. He had fought me with power and influence, the weapons of a bully. I would fight him with statutes and compliance codes, the weapons of an auditor. I drove to a 24-hour copy center and spent my last few dollars printing the entire data set. I organized the documents not by date, but by criminal violation, wire fraud, embezzlement, and the crown jewel I had discovered at 3 a.m. while cross-referencing his shell companies against federal databases, massive systemic tax evasion. Richard had not just stolen from me. He had hidden that income from the United States government. He had forgotten the cardinal rule of organized crime that even the most hardened mobsters knew. You do not steal from the Internal Revenue Service. I met Elias Henderson, my grandfather's attorney, at his private residence at 7 a.m. He opened the door in his bathrobe, confused, but the look on my face stopped him from asking questions. I laid the spreadsheet on his kitchen table. I showed him the transfers to RH Ventures. I showed him the lack of tax filings for the shell corporations. I showed him the signature lines where Richard had forged Arthur's authorization. Elias turned pale. He realized that as the administrator of the trust, his license was on the line if he did not act. By 8 o'clock, we were on a conference call with the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. I did not speak as a daughter. I spoke as a forensic accountant, providing a roadmap to a conviction. I gave them the account numbers, the routing codes, and the location of the physical servers. I gave them everything they needed to issue an immediate warrant for wire fraud and money laundering. Then I prepared for the performance. Arthur's farewell party was held 2 days later at the Halloway family estate in Lake Forest. It was a black tie affair intended to send the patriarch back to Europe with the illusion that his legacy was intact. I arrived late. I had sold my grandmother's vintage watch to a pawn shop to pay for a suit. It was midnight blue, tailored to within an inch of its life, sharp enough to cut glass. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek bun. No loose strands, no chaos. I walked through the French doors leading to the ballroom. The room was a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air smelled of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. Richard was holding court near the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, the other resting possessively on the waist of the woman from the penthouse. He was introducing her as his new strategic partner. He looked triumphant, a man who believed he had successfully pruned a dead branch from his family tree. The murmur of conversation died down as I walked to the center of the room. I did not look at the guests. I walked with the rhythmic click of heels, marble, a metronome of impending judgment. Richard saw me. His smile faltered, then hardened. He excused himself from his circle and marched toward me, his eyes darting to the security guards by the entrance. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid a scene. "Get out, now, before I have you dragged out. You are embarrassing yourself, Margaret. Look at you, trying to play dress-up." I did not break stride. I walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture and stepped onto the small raised platform where a grand piano and a microphone stand waited. I plugged my tablet into the audiovisual system that was set up for the farewell slideshow. Richard lunged forward. "Stop her. She is mentally unstable." Arthur stood up from his armchair in the front row. He leaned on his cane, his brow furrowed. "Let her speak, Richard." I tapped the screen. The massive projection behind me, which had been displaying nostalgic photos of the family summer home, went black. Then it illuminated with a high-resolution image of a property deed. "This is the deed to the penthouse at Lakeshore Drive," I said. My voice was amplified, crisp, and devoid of emotion. "Note the owner of the record, Richard Halloway." A ripple of whispers went through the room. Richard froze, his face drained of color, turning the shade of old ash. I swiped the screen. A spreadsheet appeared. It was simple, high contrast, easy to read even from the back of the room. "This is the trust fund ledger," I continued. "Column left shows the deposits made by Arthur Halloway for my benefit. Column right shows the withdrawals made by Richard Halloway. Note the recipients: Portia of North America, Tiffany and Company, the Four Seasons Maldives." The woman standing next to Richard took a step away from him, her eyes wide as she recognized the expenses. The guest began to back away, creating a circle of isolation around him. Richard roared, a sound of pure animalistic panic. He rushed the stage. "Turn it off, it is a lie." She doctored the numbers. I swiped to the final slide. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a digital copy of a federal subpoena. "And this," I said, looking directly into his eyes, "is the investigation launched this morning by the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS and the FBI for wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. The evidence has already been submitted and verified." Richard scrambled onto the stage. His hand raised to strike me, to smash the tablet to stop the flow of truth. He was no longer the smooth CEO. He was a cornered rat. Arthur Halloway moved faster than I thought possible for a man of his age. He brought his heavy ebony cane down hard on the wooden floorboards with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Enough. Richard stopped his hand mid-air, trembling. He looked at his father, searching for an ally for the man who had bailed him out of trouble his whole life. "Dad, she is lying," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "She is trying to ruin me." Arthur looked at him. The affection, the pride, the hope that had been in his eyes just days ago was gone. In its place was a profound, terrifying disgust. "I did not raise a thief," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You stole from your own child. You looked me in the eye and lied to me for a decade." Arthur straightened his spine. "You are disinherited, Richard. Effective immediately. You are no longer my son. You are a stranger to me." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of heavy boots on the marble floor cut him off. The double doors swung open. 4 agents in windbreakers emblazoned with federal insignias entered the room. They did not look at the guests. They looked only at the man on the stage. "Richard Halloway," an agent announced. "You are under arrest." Richard looked at me. For the first time, he truly saw me. He did not see a mouse. He did not see a bad asset. He saw the auditor, and he saw the balance coming due. I watched as they handcuffed him, his silk suit crumpling under the metal. I did not smile. I simply closed my tablet, disconnected the cable, and stepped off the stage. The audit was complete. The flash of the police cruisers faded into the distance, leaving the estate in a silence that felt heavier than the noise of the arrest. Richard was gone. The woman from the penthouse had vanished before the second set of handcuffs clicked, leaving behind nothing but a scent of expensive perfume and an empty champagne glass. A week later, I stood in the center of the living room at Lakeshore Drive. The floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, a vast expanse of deep sapphire that met the horizon in a perfect straight line. It was the view Arthur had wanted for me. It was beautiful, but as I walked across the polished marble, my footsteps echoed with a hollow metallic ring. The air felt thin, stripped of oxygen by the years of lies that had built these walls. This place was not a home. It was a monument to a decade of theft. I sold it within the month. I did not haggle over the price. I wanted the transaction closed, the title transferred, the link severed. Once the funds cleared escrow, I sat down with Elias Henderson and drafted a wire transfer. I returned $2 million to my grandfather's primary account. He tried to stop me, his voice thick with emotion, as he told me the money was always meant for my happiness. I told him that my happiness was not a line item that could be bought by someone else. My dignity required a clean slate. I needed to know that every cent I owned moved through a ledger I had written myself. I moved into a small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood of Evanston. It was a modest house with creaky oak floors and a porch that caught the morning sun. There was no marble, no recessed lighting, and no lake view, but there was no mold. There were no Great Danes thumping on the ceiling. I spent the first Saturday morning sitting on a secondhand sofa, watching the light filter through the leaves of a maple tree in the yard. My firm had not only reinstated me, but promoted me to Director of Investigative Audits. They had issued a formal apology, realizing that the tip from Richard was a desperate attempt to obstruct justice. My reputation was no longer a liability. It was an asset. I opened my laptop and logged into my personal savings account. I looked at the balance. It was significantly smaller than the millions that had passed through my hands during the sale of the penthouse, but it was honest. It was growing dollar by dollar, built on my salary and my investments. It was a clean ledger. I felt a muscle in my shoulder relax, a tension I had carried since I was a child, finally dissolving. For 38 years, I had been an employee of my father's expectations. Now I was the sole proprietor of my existence. I looked at the numbers on the screen and I smiled. It was the first time in my life that the data and the reality were in perfect alignment. I looked out at the street, thinking of everyone who might be where I was. A year ago, I spent 38 years playing the role of the dutiful daughter. I believed that if I kept my head down, worked twice as hard as everyone else, and never asked for my share, I would eventually earn the love I was missing. I thought silence was a virtue, but I learned a bitter lesson. To a narcissist, your silence is not a virtue. It is liquid capital. It is the silence they use to mask their noise. It is the room they use to store their lies. You do not owe your parents your life simply because they gave it to you, especially if they are using it to feed their own shadows. Blood is not a non-disclosure agreement. It is not a blank check for your soul. If you are living in the basement of your own life, while someone else enjoys the view from the top floor on your dime, it is time to stop being a martyr and start being an auditor. Do not be afraid of the numbers. Do not be afraid of the truth. The truth is sharp and it can cut, but it is the only tool that can carve a path to freedom. Do not wait for someone to lower a ladder to save you. You have to be the one to flip the table. Financial autonomy and emotional independence are the only two things no one can take from you once you decide to own them. Do not let anyone, especially your own blood, hold the title to your future. Look at the life you are living right now and ask yourself if the balance sheet of your relationships is truly in equilibrium. In the world of finance, an unbalanced ledger is a sign of crisis, but in the world of family, we often mistake it for devotion. This story is more than a drama about a stolen inheritance. It is a blueprint for recognizing your own worth when the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones draining your accounts. It is time to audit your life. The most vital lesson you must take away from this is that transparency is the foundation of respect. Meg spent a decade living in a basement because she believed that suffering was a requirement for future happiness. She accepted her father's criticism as gospel, assuming that his status and confidence equated to competence and care. But confidence without accountability is often a cloak for exploitation. Have you ever felt like you were failing at life, only to realize later that the deck was stacked against you by someone you trusted? Have you ever lived small so that someone else could live large? You must understand that blood is thicker than water is a phrase often weaponized to silence the victims of family toxicity. In reality, shared DNA is not a license for theft, whether that theft is financial, emotional, or spiritual. You do not owe anyone your silence as they dismantle your future. If you are working 40 hours a week or more and still struggling to breathe while a family member flourishes on the periphery of your efforts, you are not a good child or a loyal sibling. You are a source of passive income. Richard relied on Meg's adherence to the rules to keep her trapped. He knew she valued order, so he gave her a false set of rules to follow. He knew she was responsible, so he burdened her with the responsibility of his own failures. The lesson here is educational. Understand your own personality traits and how they can be used against you. If you are a giver, know that there are people who will make taking their full-time job. Ask yourself these difficult questions. Is the person you are helping truly in need, or are they just unwilling to change their lifestyle? Are you being asked to sacrifice for the greater good of the family, or is that good only benefiting one person at the top? When you bring up your concerns, are you met with facts, or are you met with gaslighting and emotional manipulation? Reclaiming your power requires a tactical shift. Meg stopped fighting with her heart and started fighting with her head. She used the very skills that defined her career to dismantle the lies that defined her life. You must do the same. Education is your greatest defense. Learn about your rights, learn about your finances, and learn the difference between a healthy boundary and a wall. A boundary is a gate that you control. It allows the good in and keeps the bad out. A wall is what you build when you have already let the bad in and have no other way to survive. How many of you are currently sitting in your own version of a Cicero basement? Maybe it isn't a physical apartment. Maybe it is a dead-end job you stay in to support a parent's lifestyle, or a relationship where you provide all the emotional labor while receiving none of the security. Feel the weight of that damp air. Listen to the footsteps of those who are walking all over your ceiling. Now realize that the door is not locked. The only thing keeping you there is the belief that you don't deserve the lake view. The transition from asset to owner is the most significant move you will ever make. It requires you to look at the numbers, the hours spent, the money lost, the tears shed, and realize that the return on investment is zero. When a business realizes an asset is non-performing, it divests. When you realize a relationship is parasitic, you must do the same. This isn't about being cold, it is about being precise. It is about survival. You are the chief executive officer of your own existence. You are the only person who can authorize a withdrawal from your time or your bank account. As you reflect on this journey, I want you to share your thoughts. Have you ever had a light bulb moment where the logic of a situation finally overrode the loyalty you felt? What was the first step you took to regain control? Your story could be the catalyst that helps someone else open their own laptop and start their own audit. Don't wait for a terminal crisis to change your life. Don't wait for Arthur to return and point out the lake view you're missing. Start today. Open your eyes to the facts. Clear the fog from your windshield. The books are open, the pen is in your hand, and the final balance is waiting to be written. Who will you allow to sign your name today?
Nhà quê, người nhà quê. Hả?